Hi there, everyone. My name is Avior, and welcome to the world of Aldnoah.Zero. Aldnoah.Zero is my favorite anime. If you've heard of it before, you might be aware that it doesn't have the best reputation. Now, because of that, I've kind of chosen to ignore any discussion about it online, but recently things have changed a little bit. Somehow, we're getting new content after a whole decade in the form of a recap movie and a post-series OVA. I am very confused. But that does mean that new people might be getting into the show now, which is cool, but I do feel like it's my moral imperative to try and improve the show's reputation. The thing is, the show's reputation is bad, but only in the West. In Japan, it was actually quite well liked. Which kind of begs the question, what went wrong over here? Well, a blogger by the name of Carice, I hope I'm saying that right, wrote a number of posts about the show back when it was airing, and I think a few of them really helped to put this issue into perspective and explain what happened when it made the jump from Japan over to us. So big thanks to them. If you want to read any of their articles, they will be linked below, but they do have spoilers, so be aware of that. Now, as far as I've seen, there's not really any good place for new fans to kind of apprise themselves of the situation, so this video is going to be an attempt to become that place. I'll explain a little bit about the show's in-world history, talk about some of the major themes and motifs, and hopefully give you an idea of what you might be getting into and if it's something that you'll actually be interested in. So if that sounds good, let's get into it. So, starting with the history lesson. Some of the stuff is covered early on in the show, but this should hopefully give you a slightly fuller idea of where the show begins. I plan to make another video later that will go over all of this in extreme detail, but today it'll just be a quick overview because I don't think you need to know every tiny fact just to get into the show. So, Aldnoah.Zero follows our history up until 1972 with Apollo 17. Now, if you're not a space nerd like me, Apollo 17 was the last of the US's manned lunar missions and is also the last one in the world to date. In the show, the astronauts on the mission discover a hypergate on the moon that allows them to travel to Mars almost instantaneously. No one knows exactly where this thing came from. Theories suggest it's technology that was left behind by some ancient Martian civilization, and that's really fascinating, but oddly enough, it's actually not that important at all, so we're just going to move right along. At the same time, they discover another technology called Aldnoah, which is a source of infinite energy. Now, if you're thinking that humanity used these powers wisely and advanced science ethically, I don't know where you even got that inkling, because obviously the first thing they did with it was try to colonize Mars. Did this work? Sort of. Did it work well? Definitely not. The Mars colony has a very small population, and they are reliant on Earth for resources to live off of because even with the power of Aldnoah, turning a barren frozen sand planet into an even passably livable space is nearly impossible. Of course, Earth either can't or won't send them enough supplies to really thrive, so instead of realizing the futility of their efforts in returning home, they instead decided to declare independence. Classic move. From here, which is the year 1985, they formed the Vars Empire. Now, this just catapults the situation from bad to worse, as you would imagine, establishing a feudal system where most Martian citizens are barely surviving, and even the elite, who are better off by a huge margin, still have to consider boiled chicken a delicacy. They get by for a number of years, but the collective strength of the Martian people is wearing quite thin. Tensions rise, and as the first emperor abdicates the throne, due to his poor health, his son takes over. Now, his son is a young man, and he's ready to start some shit. He puts all his efforts into fortifying Mars' military, feeding propaganda to the Martian citizens that the people of Earth are to blame for all their suffering. Yep, it's definitely Earth's fault, and not their collective hubris. This works magnificently, just like it does in real life, and they use the hypergate to launch an attack on Earth. The people of Earth, who we call the Terrans, did see this coming, and also got their military ready, but to say that they had even like a sliver of a fighting chance would be far too generous. The Martians rock up to this battle in custom-built mechs which each possess unique abilities and the infinite power of Aldnoah, and the Terrans have basic tanks and machine guns. As you might imagine, it's an absolute bloodbath. Now, both luckily and unluckily for the Terrans, the war is brought to an abrupt end by a catastrophe. The hypergate on the moon was evidently not rated to move such heavy artillery, and under the strain it suddenly explodes, taking out a huge chunk of the moon with it. The good news is, Earth is now cool like Saturn and Uranus and has rings. The bad news is this causes widespread natural disasters and basically halves the population of Earth in one fell swoop. This event is dubbed Heaven's Fall, and it occurs in 1999. Both sides suppress information about this event, the Martians to save face, and the Terrans to not cause widespread panic. After this, both sides are in rather dire straits. The Terrans were already losing by a landslide, and now the Martians are stranded on the Earth side of the solar system with no hope of backup. To make matters worse, a good number of their own were killed in the blast, including their Emperor. Both sides have no choice but to hastily sign a peace treaty, and the previous Emperor returns to the throne and orders the return of his knights to Mars. The Knights, however, decide to stay in orbit around Earth in case this tenuous treaty falls through. Fair enough, I guess. This is more or less still the state of things 15 years later, where the show officially begins. The younger Emperor's only daughter, Princess of Salem, is making a goodwill mission to Earth in the hopes that it will strengthen this threadbare peace they've managed to uphold, but most people can see that it's probably too late for that. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about the history of Mars, there's something that the show's world implies about its theme. The history of Mars is very short. So I initially found this really strange. If the history of the colony on Mars is barely over 30 years old at the beginning of the show, how did they ever get to the point of attacking Earth? The vast majority of Martian citizens would probably have been born there, and really many of the characters in the show are easily old enough to have at the very least been alive at the time of the creation of the Vars Empire. I wondered why they didn't push back the history of Vars a little further, but it started to make sense to me the more I watched. One of the show's themes is identity and nationality. Now, just like in real life, these two things often form the basis of hatred. The creation of an us allows for a creation of a them. Even though the Martian colony and the Vars Empire are absurdly young, they have a strong sense of nationality that probably grew from surviving the harsh conditions of their new home, and that was further bolstered by the lack of aid from Earth and the propaganda of their second emperor. Without this, the logical decision would probably have been to declare the colony project a failure and return to Earth, at least until better colonization plans could be made, but they considered themselves different, and because of the power of Aldnoah, also above the Terrans, and so they didn't want to do this. In the end, they doomed themselves, and dragged Earth down with them. I'm obligated to start this next section with the classic Gundam meme, because it obviously applies here, and also neatly brings us into the major theme of the show: war. Now, this is a pretty obvious theme from the start, which you could easily guess from watching any of the trailers, looking at any of the promotional materials, but Aldnoah.Zero is primarily concerned with two questions on this topic. The first is, what causes war? And the second is, how can we stop it once it's started? The blogger Carice that I mentioned earlier really shone light on this for me, because their field of study is international relations, which obviously is very concerned with these same questions. The show very obviously references some of the great minds of this space, and although I recognize these ideas in the show as probably being of some real-world significance, having someone with more knowledge on the topic lay it out was really helpful for fitting the pieces together. The article, of course, has a lot of spoilers, so I will attempt to explain it in a less spoiler-ridden format. The cause of war is somewhat well understood. Two states clashing over resources, religion, ideals, etc. naturally ends in violence. The more complicated question is how to stop it once it has already started. There have been a number of ideas put forth throughout history, some more valid than others, but there are three that are particularly relevant here. The first is that war will only end once both sides want it to end. The second is war will only end once one side completely annihilates or assimilates the other. And the third is war will only end once the human cost outweighs the gain. I can't say a whole lot more than this without getting into spoilers, but I will definitely talk more about it in another video, so for now, just keep these ideas in mind as you go through the show, and I think you will easily see how they tie into the show's overall narrative. Finally, the show brings attention to a certain phrase which it uses as a tagline. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. This is a Latin phrase, and aside from the obvious tie-in to the name of the event in the show, Heavens Fall, it brings up a few important points. First, the meaning of the phrase. Again, this is somewhat obvious, but the phrase calls for justice to be carried out no matter what the consequences are. It places justice as the utmost important rule. In the case of Aldnoah.Zero, what is just is somewhat difficult to determine. Both Earth and Mars have their own idea of it, and every character probably also has their own specific idea, and they're all equally willing to fight to see it carried out. Secondarily, the phrase harkens back to Roman theater, and by extension Greek theater. I think Greek tragedy is a decent comparison point for some aspects of the show, particularly the second season. A lot of flack was given to certain characters for dramatic decisions that they made, and though I wouldn't call that unfair, I'm tempted to call it missing the point. Putting aside the obviously immoral nature of the actions in question, their portrayal shares the style of Greek tragedy in having characters and scenes that are overly dramatic and larger than life, something that many other anime also feature. They may be unrealistic sometimes, but that's often a feature, not a bug. an intentional choice to lead you to a particular understanding of a message that is attempting to be conveyed. In a similar vein, there are clear parallels to common tropes of Greek tragedy. The first is hamartia, which is the expected downfall of a tragic hero who violates the laws of the divine not willfully, but due to a mistake or an excessive action. The second is hubris, which many of you have probably heard of. Like Icarus flying towards the sun, it's excessive pride that often leads to the downfall of the tragic hero. The third is peripeteia, which is the sudden reversal of circumstances which often comes hand in hand with some kind of revelation. And finally, catharsis, the one we're all familiar with, the sort of emotional cleansing that occurs through watching these tragic but expected scenes play out. This is again a point where I can't go into too much detail, but I think you will see the parallels as you go along. A related idea is Aldnoah.Zero's one big lie. This refers to a category on what's called the scale of science fiction hardness, which is meant to loosely define the level of realism in a sci-fi story based on real-world science as it is understood at the time of the work's creation. Hard sci-fi means that it follows the rules of science more closely, and soft sci-fi means that it's closer to fantasy with science elements. The one big lie category falls more on the hard side of the scale and is defined by introducing one or a couple major impossible or unrealistic concepts and basing the rest of the science on how that would affect the world. The power of Aldnoah is the lie. We can't have a source of infinite energy, but the way that it's used is otherwise respectful to the ideas of science, and the show is actually quite detailed in the way that it deals with these principles. To tie this into the same idea as Greek tragedy, could the show have used only perfectly realistic or realistically extrapolated ideas of technology? Sure. But it chooses not to, because this path allows for a clearer depiction of its themes than would be possible if it were strictly bound to natural law. If you're still with me, I'm honestly impressed. This has been a lot. One of the things that Carice touched on in their articles is the importance of promotion for an original anime like Aldnoah.Zero. It had a huge promotional campaign, including on-site advertisements, magazine interviews with the creators, and a bunch of other materials that were released for fans to collect. Most of these were in print, but only the online materials were available to the Western audience. All in all, we basically didn't see all the interviews and in-world documents that set up what the show was meant to be about, which obviously led to some misunderstandings, especially regarding the second season, which is more concerned with these themes. Almost everything I've gone over in this video is covered in that promotional material, and there's still a good amount that has never been translated. Obviously, it's not ideal to have seen that promotional material ahead of time, but I think the huge rift is also explained somewhat through different expectations of how stories about war tend to be portrayed and played out in Western canon. Even without any prompting, the way the story goes would be less surprising for someone without those prior ideas. All of this to say, managing expectations is one of the most important and oft-forgotten things in the world of making content, so this last section will be about that. First off, Aldnoah.Zero is indeed a mecha anime, but don't expect it to be super action-oriented. Sure, there are some great battles throughout, but the show is much more concerned with its themes than it is with making flashy action sequences. Secondly, if you've gotten this far, you probably realize that if you're not interested in philosophy, this might not be the show for you. And that's about it. The show does have its faults. No one, including me, is claiming that it's perfect. There are also a couple instances of mistranslation even in the official subtitles, which further complicates things. However, if you're willing to exercise your ability to see a diamond in the rough, there's a lot to enjoy here. I hope more people will get to see that. There will be more Aldnoah.Zero videos headed your way in the future, as well as more stuff about analyzing stories and mechanics in anime, games, and more, so if that sounds interesting to you, consider hitting that subscribe button. See you all in the next one.